Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp July. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is July 3rd, 2024, the day before the 248th anniversary of the adoption of the American Declaration of Independence. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your host. We can take your questions and comments either by email at questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them in the chat page on YouTube. There are lots of questions on the war danger, the strategic situation, but I want to begin with a story that's been dominating the press and the discussion in the United States, which is the implications of the frighteningly bad performance by Joe Biden at the presidential debate last week. The Democrats are scrambling to decide whether they should keep him in the race. Can they get him out? Because it appears he would lose badly to Donald Trump. But you asked a different question. You said, given that he appeared unable to complete a sentence, who's running the country? And so the first question I have is from Dave in Illinois, who asks you, what is your answer to that question? Who or what institutions are making policy? And do they really think they could cover up Biden's deteriorating condition until November?
Well, I think that the terrible outcome of this debate has indeed put the spotlight on the reality, and many people have been suspecting that. I mean, you had over the last actually decades, one can say, a lot of discussion about the so-called deep state in the United States. Now, the mainstream politicians and media would discount that as conspiracy theories, and this is completely off the wall. On the other side, it cannot be hidden anymore, because if Biden, according to some observers, is showing signs of increased age since about 5 years, that indeed puts the question: if he cannot get through a debate of, I think, 90 minutes, how can he stand the pressure of having, the executive power over an extremely complex superpower, which has almost 1,000 military bases around the world, which has an enormous, diplomatic intelligence, all kinds of operations around the world. Obviously, if you are totally fit in your best age, it's a big job. But if you're frail, it does put the question on the table: who is indeed having the nuclear button in its control? Now, I think that in the context of this debacle, several names were named. One of them being Tom Donilon, formerly already with the Biden, practically with the Obama administration, now being in the board, I think, of BlackRock investment, some fund or institute. Now, this is indeed very, very clear that you have, and we had several discussions with experts in the meantime, that there is obviously the permanent bureaucracy. These are people who have been in the revolving door between posts in the administrations and going to top executive posts in the defense industry, then taking some top position in some media control. So what is very clear is that there is this permanent bureaucracy, and it is practically what Ray McGovern always calls the Mickey Met, the military-industrial, congressional, intelligence, academia, think tank complex. I probably forgot one or two. And within that you have a power structure, and I think that the combination of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the military, academia, think tanks, there is a certain structure which obviously has a hierarchy, and what that hierarchy is at each given point obviously needs to be identified. But it poses the obvious question: if all this hoopla about the presidential election, congressional elections, Senate elections, if all of that, it doesn't really mean much, because if you have practically a completely different apparatus which is permanent and which does not change between the administration, it does not really matter if the outcome is Republican or Democrat. What then happens to democracy? What happens to the rules-based order? What happens to all of this nice narrative that we in the West are the good ones, fighting against all the evil ones, namely the autocracies and the dictatorships of this world? I mean, it puts a big hole into this narrative, and I think it makes it very clear that that the American people really have to think of, if they want to continue to let their country switch back from starting off in the American Revolution as a republic, fighting for their independence against the imperial empire, the great British Empire, fighting to get out of the colonial status, which over the several 100 years, 250 years, or a little bit more, has swung back to basically becoming an empire by adopting step by step the model of the British Empire as the basis to run the unipolar world based on the Anglo-American system. And that is posed by this whole debacle in a very clear way. So I think, this is an incredible period. And I think, the question of what will become of America, tomorrow we have the 4th of July, that's a very good moment to rethink, is it not better to think about the principles of the American Revolution, the ideals of the founding fathers, especially also later John Quincy Adams' foreign policy, because it is the question of how will the rest of the world relate to the United States, and how does the United States relate to the rest of the world. So I think people should reflect about that, and I think the issue is not so much, there are all kinds of scenarios naturally. For example, that Obama would have, basically had secret meetings with Biden, telling him that he should resign, or calling for an open convention. And then some scenarios are that then Michelle Obama would spring out of the wonder box as the miracle solution, or Gretchen Whitmer for that matter, or some other people are obviously smelling spring air around this whole fight. But that's not really the fundamental question. The question is, can the United States find back to its Republican tradition? And that will probably decide over war and peace on a global scale.
Well, it's funny you should bring that up, because I had 3 questions from people asking about, was this whole thing orchestrated so that Biden could be removed and bring in Hillary or Michelle? And, people get too caught up in these scenarios and miss the bigger point. But we do have a question that came in from a contact in Florida who asked the question, why is there still so little discussion of the NATO escalation, given that the war in Ukraine appears to be lost?
Well, I think that the present policies, are heading up to the NATO summit, which will take place in a few days in Washington. And I think for that we can expect, that there will be a difficult moment, because, the NATO and with that the collective West have a big problem with the war being lost in Ukraine. It's a tremendous damage to the reputation of NATO. remember that it is not so long ago that NATO, in a rather shameful way, abandoned Afghanistan after being there for 20 years, spending $2 trillion, leaving the country in a complete shambles, where, some have made the argument that only if 3% of that money would have been spent on building infrastructure, industry in Afghanistan, the country could have been in an excellent condition, but obviously it wasn't. And in the same way, what will be the result of the Ukraine war? The country will be devastated after more than 2 years of war, which could have been ended in March 22 already, as clearly documents prove. So now the question is, what will be the narrative NATO will come up with at this summit? This will be extremely important, because obviously all signs, and Biden said so himself, are that the reason why NATO has to continue this war against Russia in Ukraine, or they don't admit it, but that's de facto the case, is because supposedly Putin will not stop there. He will go on to the Baltics. He will go on to Poland, and that's why why the war effort has to be escalated. Now it happens that is the one most glaring untruth, if not to call it a lie, because the facts are, and that has been on the record. There was a meeting in Istanbul in March, April 22, which was a negotiated agreement between Putin and Zelensky. Both of them had agreed to end the war. Putin stopped the fighting and agreed to a settlement if Ukraine would accept not to join NATO, and some other questions were postponed into the future, like what happens to Crimea. But there was the definite proof that Putin had agreed to a peace deal and had stopped the fighting. Now, that was not coming from Russian sources. This comes from Ukrainian sources. This was reported in the Kiev Pravda and was stated by the chief negotiator of Zelensky participating in the Istanbul discussions. Now, that basically blows apart the entire story that Putin wants to reconquer the Soviet Union. Putin, in the meantime, has said several times that he has no such intention. He does not want to take over all of Ukraine. He just, insists that those places which have voted to be part of the Russian Federation in the meantime would remain so, and that Ukraine has to accept neutrality and not join NATO, and then can have security guarantees and so forth. But I think that particular point, I really want to put people's attention to, because if that narrative that Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union remains, then that is the pretext for the escalation and the formula which will get us into World War III in the shortest period of time. And as long as it is believed, naturally, then you don't have to pick up on Putin's peace offer, which he pronounced on the June 14th in his speech in front of the Russian Foreign Ministry. And that means no diplomacy, just war escalation. And we have to do nothing more urgent than to stop the escalation before it is too late and go back to diplomacy. I mean, it's not a settled agreement which we should look at. I mean, that is topic to negotiations, the topic of diplomacy. But we have to reintroduce a diplomatic approach, or else we are on the short fuse to World War III.
Now, on this upcoming NATO summit, we do have a question from a contact in Glasgow, Scotland, who asks if we know what will come from the NATO summit. She expressed her concern with the European Union, the new leadership, referring in particular to Kallas from Estonia, But she also said that there's a lot of talk about preparation for war, including what's going on in Germany, and wanted to know if you have some idea of what actually is occurring in Germany in terms of this preparation for what they say is the inevitable Putin invasion of the West.
Yes, there is actually a quite scandalous interview, which was aired, I think, yesterday by NTV. That's I think, a private TV channel, and Lieutenant Brigadier Bodemann, who is the territorial commander of the Bundeswehr. And there in this interview, which I can only advise you to look at, it's not very long, 15 minutes. It's in German, but I guess you can somehow get undertitles if you want to know. And what he there says is really incredible. It basically is something which has been in preparation in Germany since January of this year. And I think it was sort of made official in March, and now it's being brought to the public. It's called Operational Plan Germany. And what it is basically a plan where if it would come to a war, the scenario which Bodemann presented is the following. He said American troops are landing in Holland, and then they're marching through Holland on various ways, street, highway, railway, waterways. And then they come to Germany, and here comes the job of basically the civil services, the defense civil services, because the Bundeswehr, the majority, are already at the East Front, meaning at the Russian border. And that therefore, there has to be a supply system whereby the German civil organizations are supplying these allied troops, mostly Americans, who are marching across Germany to join the forces at the East Front. You have to set up stations in the highways, parking lots, and you have to supply them with food, fuel, sanitation equipment, according to the host nation agreement. And basically all the civil organizations, the Red Cross, the Johanniter, various other organizations, all have to join in and supply these foreign troops. Now, that is incredible. He talks like as if this is happening tomorrow. The Americans are landing at Normandy Beach again. Now, changing it a little bit in Holland. And they're marching to the East Front, and then Germany, he says, is you can't look at the old operational plan of the Cold War period, because fortunately, luckily, Germany is no longer a front state, but we are now in the rear, and we have to supply those who are fighting at the front lines. Now, what he says as an argumentation is really unbelievable, and I think it cannot let be stand. Because this is the blueprint for the coming war. He says, Germany is already under attack, all kinds of attacks, cyber attack, all kinds of other such infrastructure attacks on critical infrastructure. And unbelievably, he then says, look what happened to Nord Stream 2. Now, if I ever have seen a case of chutzpah, then I think the prize goes to this Lieutenant General Bodemann, because, this attack on Nord Stream 2, okay, we don't know who it was. There is a cover story that it was some Ukrainian ship, which has been dismissed by any expert I know of. There is the still unrefuted story by Seymour Hersh that it was Americans who did it with help of Norwegians and so forth. But in any case, the cui bono for sure is not Russia, because what happened? There are actually analyses which argue that apart from cutting Germany off cheap Russian natural gas, the largest geopolitical aim was to ruin the relationship between Germany and Russia so fundamentally and so good, that it would serve the long-standing American interest, this is attributed to George Friedman, to separate Germany from Russia, because the combination of Russian raw materials and German scientific and technological know-how together in the view of the geopoliticians in the United States would mean a combination which, would be an earnest enemy of the United States. This is all geopolitical gobbledygook, but that's how the story goes. Now, the cui bono is for sure not Russia blowing up its own pipeline. And that particular incident has ruined Germany. Germany is now plunging into a depression, collapsing right and left. The very existence of Germany as an industrial nation is being sabotaged and ruined. Now, it takes quite a chutzpah for this Bodemann to attribute, to just weave it in the narrative. He doesn't say explicitly it was the Russians, but he says it in the context of the Russian threats as part of many other threats. I mean, we used to call this fallacy of composition. If you insinuate something which changes the meaning of the entire story, I think they have now a new word for it, which is called decontextualization or so. It's a classical case of such a thing. And then, the second thing is Bodemann also repeats what Biden said a couple of days earlier, that Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. And that is just not true. I mean, I just mentioned these facts. There was yesterday a very thorough article by Ray McGovern in Consortium News, where he cites quote and chapter, which quote from which main advisor of Zelensky, the chief negotiator in Istanbul, basically said that. So it's not Russian sources, it's Ukrainian sources which admit that Russia had already stopped the war in 2022 in March, and that it was Boris Johnson who flew in from London to tell Zelensky, no, do not go with this peace agreement, continue to fight, we will back you up, to the last Ukrainian. He didn't say that, but that's what it turns out to be. Now, that whole thing must be investigated. I mean, this is public records. War and peace hangs on that question. And I can only say any serious journalist should investigate, was that the case, that Russia was ready or already stopped the fighting, ready for a peace deal, and what was the role of Boris Johnson to sabotage that? I think if that is not highlighted and investigated, then we are indeed, blind walking to World War III.
You're listening to Helga Zepp July. We have a few minutes left. If you want to get a question in, you can send it to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. I have a question for you, Helga, from a podcaster in Germany who said, I'm confused about Putin's idea of a Eurasian security alliance. I'm not sure how the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization represent an asymmetric response to the military provocations and threats from NATO. Can you explain this?
Well, I think it's not so difficult because, what is at the bottom of the proposal by Putin to have a Eurasian infrastructure, security architecture based on, cooperation for infrastructure, based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, open, he said explicitly, to NATO members. Then if you look at the proposal, which was reiterated by President Xi Jinping at the conference which just took place in Beijing on the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, promoted 70 years ago by Zhou Enlai, and which was then elaborated on the Bandung conference in 55, leading to the beginning of the non-aligned movement. That was always the idea that you have to have a system based on the sovereignty of all members, based on the principle of non-interference, of acceptance of the other social system of the other country, cooperation to the benefit of each other. I think these are the main points. And, the BRICS and many other organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, the Eurasian Economic Union, the African Union, Mercosur, I think that's the main bulk of these organizations. They want to create a new system, a new security architecture based on these principles. Now, I have made immediately after the special military operation started in February 22, it was clear to me that this was leading to potentially World War III. Not the Russian attack, but the whole dynamic of which the Russian attack was just a certain trigger point. So I proposed at that point to have a new global security and development architecture involving every single nation on the planet, because given the interwovenness of the world, the strategic intertwinedness, the fact of nuclear weapons, of pandemics, of the internet, of just the way how the modern world is really one. You cannot have a partial security. If you leave out any country like North Korea or Iran or whatever, it has the seed of the next war. This is the lesson we should have learned from the Versailles Treaty, which did not conclude and end the First World War, but it was just the stepping stone for the Second World War. And the one lesson we should have learned from the Peace of Westphalia is that if you want to have a functioning peace agreement, you have to have something which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet, of every part involved. And that is why I proposed at that time this global security and development architecture, and subsequently 10 principles, which are the absolute crucial base which, on which such an architecture must be built. And if you look at the 10 principles, which, were published first, and then Putin's proposal and Xi Jinping's proposal, however, there is a great similarity and a great affinity. We are using slightly different formulations, but if you look at the essence of these proposals, they are the same thing. And obviously, this signifies that anybody who is thinking in terms of reason, how to get out of this situation, would come up with similar ideas. So I think the most important task, in my view, is that, that we support such an idea, that we enter new discussions for a security architecture, that we absolutely should endorse Putin's proposal. Putin has made it very clear this is not timeless. This is an offer which exists for a certain time. If the situation escalates and the military situation in Ukraine deteriorates, that offer will be taken away. So we have a window of opportunity to respond to it positively, respond positively to Xi Jinping's proposal. And I would say, if the West wants to not just be a recipient of proposals, they should, take up something like my 10 principles and start to say, okay, we are willing to go back to diplomacy, and here is what we want to contribute to such a discussion. That would be a reasonable proposal, but there is no alternative to diplomacy. The only other choice is World War III and annihilation of the entire civilization. And who in their right thinking could want that? Because even the proponents of this escalation, they would not make it either. If they think they have some private bunker, forget it. Forget it.
Well, the people can find your 10 principles on the schillerinstitute.com website. And I think also the resolution that was passed by the International Peace Coalition a week ago That's available also. We're circulating that for signatures, and that's a very good place to start in getting people to understand that there is an alternative to war. Now, I have one more question for you, which is based on the discussion of the present chaos in the US political system. Uh, Angelo from Rome writes, why and how is the presidential candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being boycotted and suppressed? And then he asks, what could be done to open up the system, to end this ability to control it this way?
I think that is a $64 million question because, the entire control of the United States has been, I would say, since the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the cover up of that assassination, moving very much in the direction of a one party system because, while the average Republican and Democratic voter may think, that they hate each other and that, they want to defeat their opponent, this candidate, the reality is on the level of the leadership, the DNC and the Republican Party leadership, the control and the issues have been identical almost entirely. So it is really, this question of the, military industrial complex plus Wall Street plus Silicon Valley plus think tanks plus academia, which is, what runs the United States. And, it seems to me that the terrible outcome of the Trump-Biden campaign poses that. And I can only say the more people intervene now in the election campaign and raise that as an issue, to say, who is running the United States when it's clear that President Biden is not, that becomes a topic in the discussion so that, basically, there is some motion whereby they cannot just run through with these things as they are. And otherwise, I can only say, we need a lot of state citizens. In a certain sense, I mean, from a historical standpoint, the American Revolution has been taken away by the empire. I mean, this is the long-standing issue, because when the British Empire lost their, in their view, most important colony, the American colony, George III went crazy over that issue. He lost literally his mind. And the British always tried to reconquer the United States. They did that in the War of 1812. They did it with the Civil War, in which the empire was allied with the Confederacy. And, after they realized that they could not win back America militarily, they started to say, okay, then we have to subvert the establishment. We have to convince the American establishment that they adopt the model of the British Empire, and then we run the world on the basis of the special relationship between the US and the British. And that has been the issue throughout the 20th century. And you had sometimes a president who would purely represent that, Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, I don't want to name all of them, Truman, for example, Nixon, and then you had some other presidents who were leaning in the opposite direction, like Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy. Clinton, I think, was a very mixed bag. He leaned towards some positive impulses sometimes, but not very consistently. So the battle really is America. H.G. Wells wrote this in The Open Conspiracy very clearly. He said, if we convince the American establishment to go with the British model, then everything is fine. And that is what has happened. Now, the 4th of July tomorrow is a time where you can do some reading up on that topic. You can go to the websites of the LaRouche organization, EIR. You can go to, the LaRouche Library website. You can read some famous books, Carol Quickly is a very interesting author on the topic. You can read the H.G. Wells Open Conspiracy, very interesting. And I mean, there is a lot of literature where you can form your own, judgment about this question. But for America, to either join with the British Empire or to go back to the own tradition of the founding fathers of John Quincy Adams, that is really the issue which is at the heart of the identity of America. So in that sense, I wish you a very productive 4th of July reading up on this.
Of course, people shouldn't neglect reading the Declaration of Independence, which itself is a very profound explanation of what the Founding Fathers intended. Helga, I would just like to add that people should know that the International Peace Coalition will be having the weekly Zoom call on Friday. This is an opportunity to be able to hear a discussion of a number of people that are being brought around us to take up the questions that you've just been discussing of how do we break the control of the unipolar order. So I would urge people to look on the website for that information and join us on Friday. Anything else, Helga?
Well, no, I mean, if you're a red-blooded American, you should help to put America back on the foundations of the American Revolution, the American independence, and the idea of being a republic as a force of good in the world, and not go out to seek foreign monsters as it is happening nowadays a lot.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you on Friday.
Yes, till Friday.